Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. From the right, I'm Gary Pauland.
And from the left, I'm David Jones.
Tonight, we are going to discuss government shutdown. That's the federal government shutdown, David, with former U.S. Congressman and attorney Chris Bell, Ben Strusan, leader in Americans for Prosperity, and finally, someone new for us, David, Ryan Hecker, who is a leader in the Houston Tea Party Society and organizer of the Contract from America, David.
That's a good one, but I didn't sign it, so I cannot be sued. Former Congressman Bell, since you have that esteemed resume, you get to tell us whether or not you're going to be very happy to see the members of Congress on the Republican side perhaps get to go home early as they shut down and continue to collect their paychecks.
I don't think anybody should be very happy. I think people should be very concerned. This could have a wide-ranging impact, and a lot of wide-ranging impact that people haven't really thought about to date. I think a lot of folks think that someone's going to blink. I still hold out some hope that will happen. But if it doesn't, I would agree with you. I think I understand the tone of your question. I think it's going to be devastating for the Republican Party, and I think that's why Harry Reid and Barack Obama have sort of held their ground. They have a pretty good idea who the American public's going to blame.
Mr. Hecker, you think somebody's going to blink, and if so, who?
I hope it's the Republicans that don't blink, because they were handed a huge election victory in November, and there was a mandate attached to it. The mandate was to cut spending. They're really representing, I think, the middle 50% of the American people, and they really need to continue to push it and not let the Democrats use the shutdown as a weapon to keep them from being able to accomplish what they were elected to do.
And finally, Mr. Strusan, are we going to be a more prosperous country if we shut the government down as we're just coming out of a recession? What do you think?
Well, I think there'll be some economic effects depending upon how long it goes on. But I think from a political standpoint, the country is prepared for sacrifice. That's what the election was about. So to the extent that the electorate can be convinced that this shutdown will result in a better economic long-term outcome for the country, I don't think it's a political liability for the Republicans.
Now, and I would ask you, Ben, how did we get here? This is 2000. We're well into the 2011 fiscal year. The Democrats ran Congress last year up till the end of December, and we're still talking about a budget for a year that's almost half over.
Yeah, well, we got here because the president and the party that controlled Congress for 2 years spent $4 trillion and increased the national debt by that amount, and the country is essentially rebelling against that spending. Now, I'll be the first to admit, because I can already hear my colleague on the left complaining about Republican spending, and I agree with them. I think Republicans overspent in the last 7 or 8 years, but the Democrats took the worst of what the Republicans did and added a zero to everything.
Okay, well, I am going to respond to that because the Republicans did spend like drunk sailors. That's probably the best way to describe what went on during the Bush administration when the Republicans controlled everything when I was there. And as far as the mandate, that's the great misunderstanding. The mandate was to get rid of Democratic leadership, and that's what the Republican Party seems to not understand. What happened last November was a great pushback against what a lot of people saw as Democratic extremist positions. But what the American people don't want is those same types of extremist positions being put forth by the Republican Party. And that's what's going on.
But the problem is that these aren't extremist positions. Saying that they want to cut $100 billion from a several $1 trillion deficit is not an extreme position, and it's surprising to me that the Democrats seem to be, their basic position seems to be, let's cut nothing. And if you want to cut more than that, that's extreme, and we have to meet somewhere between zero and whatever you want to cut.
No, that's not true at all. You can't come to any kind of agreement. The truth of the matter is the Tea Party doesn't want compromise. John Boehner is horrified by some kind of compromise because he knows that folks like Ryan are going to go punish his members in the next election cycle. That's why they keep having a moving target. They said the target was $33 billion. Now it's not $33 billion anymore. Now it's over $40 billion.
The mandate was three things. Number one is repeal Obamacare. That's number one. Number two was reduce deficit spending and cut the national debt. And number three was get the regulatory burden off the backs of American business so the economy can recover.
And of course,
those were the mandates
no
that
question.
the election to me signified.
And that may very well be what was in your playing card at the time that you voted. Tell us, though, how this discussion that's going on right now, which is a billion here, a billion there, means very much. When, as Ryan says, that it's actually trillions of dollars is what we're talking about.
Well,
ultimately.
we're already 6 months into the 2011 fiscal year. This should have been done prior to October 1st, as my colleague knows. Typically, the U.S. Congress will handle budget issues prior to the October 1 beginning of the fiscal year. The Democratic-controlled Congress did not do it. They punted. The White House didn't want to do it. They didn't want to take the leadership of having to cut the budget. They knew what the political results were going to be. So they waited till after the election, and now essentially Republicans control half of one part of Congress. The Republicans don't control all of Congress, and we're pushing back, and we're trying to get it done, and we're trying to reflect the results of that election.
And can I add that I actually think that, and when I said earlier that the Democrats are using this as a weapon, I seriously think they're using the shutdown as a weapon. They know right now, looking at their, at the tarot cards, that come 2012, if things don't change, they're going to lose the Senate. By a wide margin. There's 22 Democratic seats open, and a lot of them are in states that went full-scale Republican in 2010.
Well, y'all are
doing
your darndest to keep that from happening. As one of my Republican friends in D.C. told me just last week, he says, my party is doing everything to give it back to you all. And you really are. And, the Tea Party only represents a minority. It's extremely strong in a Republican primary, not very strong nationwide. And what most people recognize is that elections in this day and age are controlled by that vast middle. And that vast middle ground was very upset with the Democratic Party and voted in droves against the Democratic Party last November. They're going to come right back around, and that pendulum's going to swing if the Republicans stay on this path.
Maybe they will and maybe they won't, Chris. But let's take a step back from politics and talk about the problem. Debt, U.S. debt now at $14.2 trillion. It's not sustainable. The present system is just not going to work. Just like corporations had to reform, labor unions have had to reform. We've got to reform this federal government or we're in deep trouble. The U.S. dollar is on its way to an historic low against a basket of world currencies. We're going to end up some point in the near future, if we don't get our house in order, of not being the reserve currency anymore, which has devastating impact on this economy. That means we got serious problems. Where are the serious people that want to solve the problems on the Democratic side?
Well, I think everybody understands that, but that's not what we're talking about between today and tomorrow. $33 billion is a fraction. Or even if it goes a little bit higher than that, we're not going to solve the problem. But we're talking about trying to keep the government running, and we should at least be responsible enough to do that. And I do think we're going to have a serious discussion about where the budget goes from here. And I admire Paul Ryan for putting a marker down and saying these are some ideas that need to be discussed. I certainly don't support all of them, but I do think the discussion has to begin somewhere. I thought the commission that was appointed also brought forth some good ideas. But as all of us know who have been involved in politics, people didn't vote for sacrifice. They think they can have their cake and eat it too.
Can they?
They think you can go ahead and just keep spending as much as you want, and there's no price to be paid. And then when people start talking about cuts, that's when they quote cuts. Well, that's not what I thought.
I don't agree with that. The country has changed. The country is prepared for sacrifice. And I've seen the same poll results that you're alluding to, and typically people are okay with cutting everybody else's program.
Exactly.
Okay. But I absolutely believe that there's been a fundamental shift in this country. This country is prepared, the baby boomer generation is prepared to reduce the benefits that they're going to receive as long as those reductions are distributed equitably.
You know what they're also willing to do? They're also willing to see, by like 60% in most polls, to see the wealthiest Americans pay their fair share of our expenses. And those people have had a free ride under George Bush and even under Barack Obama for a good while. So the question comes down to, Ryan, is it not the case that when you balance a budget in your own household that sometimes you want to actually bring in money to do it, rather than eliminating your kids' scholarship applications and other, maybe your mortgage on second mortgage on a house? You just don't want to do that. So what about revenue?
we're talking about long-term fiscal stability. And when we're talking about long-term fiscal stability, it means lowering taxes, which allows individuals to spend more money on their small businesses, allows individuals to spend more money hiring people, allows when you lower the corporate tax rate, prevents money from being passed on or expenses being passed on to the consumer.
How'd that work for you during 2001 to 2008? How'd that work for you?
Well, I don't think it had anything to do with the tax cuts. I think it had to do with cutting taxes and then increasing spending by a astronomical amount. What Reagan showed was that when you cut the tax rate, what ends up happening is more revenue comes into the coffers because more people are willing to pay. There's a lot more business that's generated, which leads to them paying more taxes overall. The problem is when we have high taxes and a huge amount of spending, that leads to a whole host of problems when the American consumers the innovativeness of small businesses goes away and unemployment rises.
Well, I mean, if we're going to talk about the overall economy, I agree with you. This is not sustainable, but a lot of different ideas need to be looked at. And as long as you have this extraordinary disparity in income, with the top 1% in our society having more income than the entire bottom 50% put together, that's what's not sustainable. We have wiped out the middle class in this country. And if you really want to have a productive American society, you have to have that middle class that'll be out there buying the products that are manufactured, hopefully, here in the United States. And those are the types of policies that we need to be looking at. And there's some ideas out there that really would bring more and more Americans into that investor class so that they are in a position to grow with that top 1%.
So the tax code discriminates against the middle class accumulating wealth. Is that what you're saying?
I think there are a lot of things that have discriminated against the middle class along the way, and we've effectively destroyed it.
But how much wealth is being generated by that top 1%? I mean, that top 1% is the group of people driving businesses, is driving wealth into this country, and to say that we should tax them and therefore have that tax passed down to everyone else is a big problem.
The great consumer class in the United States has always been the middle class, those who aspire for more, those who will go out and buy those goods as they're generated, who really make up that consumer society. And you can read book after book, people a hell of a lot smarter than me, talking about the need to do something about it. And we've addressed it at other periods in our society, in our history here in the United States, and we could do it again if we were really serious.
So what do we need to do?
Well, the fallacy of the argument is making a statement that higher taxes on the wealthy will somehow improve the fiscal situation of the middle class. That is not going to happen, and history has shown it doesn't happen that way. And again, without going down a long road here, the bottom line is lower taxes are better for everybody. Now, we can talk about fair share and that type of thing, as my liberal colleague likes to do when he redistributes income from people who earn it to people who don't earn it, or from people who save to people who spend. But at the end of the day, the important thing is to keep tax rates low on the American economy so that this economy grows. And we are in a very vulnerable point in the economic recovery, and we should not be thinking about raising taxes based on where we're at, because a tax increase or failure to extend the Bush tax cuts would have resulted in a second recession.
What's the message that we're going to send to the world if we shut down the government, if we no longer have applications for small business loans, if we no longer are cleaning up toxic waste sites, if the military is not being paid, which they will not be. They will be working for nothing. Our military will. They will not get a paycheck. What's the world going to think of the great colossus, the United States, if we go there?
Well, I mean, I'd like to first point out that the Republicans today, asked for an extension through October for military pay, with an extension for 1 week, overall for the government shutdown.
Which the president has said he will veto.
Yeah. So I think, it's both sides have to work together and reach a compromise. Now, honestly, I don't think the world's going to end if we extend military pay and then we have a government shutdown. I think people are going to come to the realization that it's actually not that big a deal. I mean, they're not going to be audited by the IRS either during that time period.
You're willing to allow National Institutes of Health to not enroll other people in medical trials hospitals where cancer could be protected. You're willing to shut all of that down.
That doesn't happen in a short term. Look, the bottom line is,
No.
if it's shut down, it won't be for long because Obama ultimately is going to blink. What's going on here, in my opinion, is it's politics. And the problem, I think, for America, and we've talked about this before, we've gotten away from when the political campaigns end, it's time to be legislators and work together like used to be done in Austin. Maybe at one point was done in Washington, but it hadn't been done for a long time. So now we have politics all day, every day, 365 days a year, and there are no or very few statesmen left who are willing to sit together and work and solve the problems of America. We're not doing that.
You're referring to Mr. Boehner, of course?
I'm referring to the whole lot of them.
Oh,
it's
okay.
time to get stuff done. We are in serious, serious trouble. We're going to be a second or third class nation if we don't address these problems. And just saying it's okay, we'll kick it down the road and let the next generation handle it again like we've always done is total irresponsibility. It is time, and I think Ben Strusand's right. I think the American people understand that we've got to do some tough things. We've got to button our chin straps. We've got to work harder because we are slipping as a country. As a nation, we've got to get our act together, and the politicians, quite frankly, are getting in the way.
Well, if they really understood that, Gary, Paul Ryan, who took a rather courageous step in putting that document forward, because it is going to be attacked.
Of course, for political
there's a reason
reasons.
he left Social Security off the table, because it's a sacred cow, and he knew that the fire would light up so brightly that it would be dead before it even got out the door. And folks like in the Tea Party, and there's some on the left who have done the exact same thing, have made compromise a bad word. That if you compromise, if you agree at all with the other side, we will punish you through the primary process. And, people pay attention in politics, and they obviously saw what happened last November. They saw the success of the Tea Party in the Republican primary system, and they're horrified. And quite frankly, John Boehner really isn't cut from that cloth, but he's between a rock and a hard place. And if you've seen some of the polling numbers for those freshman Republicans, they have to be horrified. They're polling with 30% approval ratings in district after district after district. Those are bad numbers to be taking into an election cycle.
Nobody wants to ruin healthcare services for the elderly just so you can prove a political point, Mr. Struzan. Nobody wants to do that.
Well, David,
nobody wants to make Medicare a block.
I know people are going to be in the streets, and there's going to be homeless, and Granny's going to get thrown out of the nursing home. I mean, we hear that out of Austin too. We hear it out of Washington. But let me just say, this is just a skirmish. This extension, it's the skirmish. The big fight is going to be over extending the national debt because that's where the threat is, $14.2 trillion of national debt. And the huge battle is going to be over the Republican budget proposal as outlined by Congressman Ryan. And we'll see. But this is just the first small step.
I'll face two things. First of all, I mean, the presentation of the Tea Party as some far-right movement. I mean, we're an economic conservative movement which should represent the very, middle. I mean, that's why we won. It wasn't some, outrage. It was an outrage driven by the Tea Party movement that led to, a historical number of seats that turned over. And beyond that, I mean, I don't like how the debate's presently being projected by the media that by the Republicans offering a budget or a continuing resolution that cuts spending, that all of a sudden they're the ones that are driving a government shutdown. Isn't it the president and the Senate which did it, which lost, pretty much their party lost the last election? Isn't it in their hands to accept that budget, to accept the mandate that was given to them, to the Republican Party
I
in
guess
the last
Obama
elections?
should just ignore that he won 53% of the vote.
Yeah, but that was 2 years ago.
And
eternity.
365 in the electoral.
political
He should just
landscape
ignore.
And people,
changed.
memories are long in D.C. And folks remember what happened in 1995. It completely turned everything around. Newt Gingrich stepped in it, thought he really had Bill Clinton cornered, let the government shut down, and the price was very heavy. And I think people are expecting the same thing happen. They are polling every day, and they know where the folks are putting the blame. And I think Ryan's right. You may not like it, but it isn't going to change. They are putting the blame on the Republican Party.
And I think that's what the Democrats are hoping for. I mean, I think they see
Well,
the
of
writing on the
course,
wall,
it's
and they
politics.
want to shut down the government. I think the Democrats actually wanted to shut down the government because they'll place the blame on the Republicans, and maybe their prospects in the future will be better.
Pass a temporary budget, send it to the president.
Yeah,
He
this
wants
is
to
not
veto it,
1995.
let him veto it. Then it'll be the president's fault.
This is not 1995. Who
But
could
the
disagree
big problem
who could
is-
disagree with
How
that?
It's
about
not
this?
1995, but politics is cyclical, and things have a tendency to, in history,
But let's
has a
talk
tendency
about
to
Barack
repeat
Obama.
itself.
Where has he been? Okay, why wasn't he haranguing last summer and in the fall Where's my budget? Why don't I have a budget out of the Congress? He left Harry Reid, Nancy Pelosi, and the massive Democratic majorities in both houses alone to do whatever they wanted, because their plan all along was, when they saw the handwriting on the wall, let's give it to the Republicans. And I actually think they wanted the Republicans to win the Senate
have them
too,
served there,
so
Gary.
they could then create a recreation of Bill Clinton with Newt Gingrich. But by the way, I don't think that's going to happen either, because I do think the American people understand the problem, Chris. And the Democrats, they're wishing to get control. And Chris, if Chris is right, and the Democrats take all control, and these fundamental reforms are not done, what do you think is going to happen 2 years later?
Well,
They'll probably be ready to impeach Obama.
I know there's a succinct question in there somewhere, but I'm having a difficult time finding it.
Hey, it's his show, and he can run his mouth if he wants to.
Thank you, David.
I think that we have to ask our friends here. Since you're willing to shut down the government yourself, I mean, you're saying no compromise. You hope Obama blinks, but you're willing to go the extra mile. It seems to me the question that becomes isn't the real goal of the extremists, and there are extremes in this country. We'd all be lying to each other if we said they're not extremists on the left. On the right, they're extremists. That's not a surprise.
It's extremist to be a balanced budget fan.
No, they want to, out of this ruin, have a new society emerge, a new government mentality. That's all that I can understand.
I don't know what he's talking
You
about.
want to see the government rendered to immobility and nothing, so you can say to the American people, it doesn't work.
We just want $40 billion in budget cuts this year, David. It's not that big of a deal. It's 33 versus 40.
Well, out of a
$500 billion discretionary spending portion of a $3.7 trillion budget. That's what we're talking about.
7.5%.
That doesn't sound particularly radical to me after your side just spent $4 trillion in the past 2 years.
I think they had to spend some money, otherwise we'd have been in the ditch a very long time. In something called a depression.
With a similar situation, although it can't shut down, going on in Austin, and with facing major financial problems there, Senator Whitmire had a great quote this week talking about how all the Republicans constantly talk about wanting to run government like a business. He said, well, let's run it like a business. There's a lot of demand for our product. And there is a lot of demand for the
So how
product.
you paying for it, Chris?
Yeah. How do they make money at it?
Well, but people don't want to pay for it. And that's why we're having this discussion.
And by the way, that is even true to the Democrats. And the Democrats, when they controlled the White House and the House and the Senate, they didn't come up with any new proposals to make the rich or whoever else they want pay the cost of all these wonderful government programs, which are, of course, highly debatable.
David is right that in that our forefathers designed a system whereby we would fund our government by taxation, and the Republicans have succeeded. And I'll give that to you, have succeeded in making any kind of new tax completely off the table and politically impossible. So it does become a very, very difficult situation to figure out how you're going to pay for everything.
So what do you think is going to happen? I mean, where will this be next week?
Next week?
Yes.
I think there'll be an extension. I think they'll come to some sort of resolution. Right now, they're fighting. I think they've agreed on the number, but they're fighting over whether or not to regulate what power the environmental protection agencies have, and whether.
So
or not
you'd like to see those riders, such as getting rid of the EPA or eliminating funding for Planned Parenthood. You'd like to see those off the table and just make a deal.
Well, no, I mean, I think I actually would like to see the EPA sort of that I'd like to see both those things. But honestly, I want to prevent a government shutdown too. But I think if there is going to be one, it's going to be short term. At some point, there's got to be a compromise that comes together from both Democrats and Republicans. The question, it comes pre-government shutdown or post-government shutdown, that compromise has to take place. I mean, our government is not going to cease to function.
Yeah, at some point they want their paychecks, right, Ben?
Yeah, the Congress is going to continue to get their paychecks, as David pointed out. But and the military will get paid, and I think that essential services will continue, although there will be some furloughs and layoffs until they get it resolved, which they eventually will get it resolved. But again, I go back. This is just a skirmish. The big battle is in May. Over $14.2 trillion extension of the debt ceiling, and that is going to be a huge fight.
And you think they're willing to go to default in May?
Well, I don't know about that, but I think if the Republicans are able to craft some kind of compromise where none of their fingerprints can be found upon it, then the government won't shut down. But it'll be the biggest game of, I didn't really have anything to do with that. I didn't really make that happen, from John Boehner and the rest of the Republican leadership that we've ever seen, because I think they really are very frightened to have explain to the American public and their supporters that they were part of the compromise.
I'm prepared to shut the government down if that's what it takes to get the spending reduced in this fiscal year. Eventually they'll get it resolved.
Well, I hope you'll let your congressman know that.
And I think that honestly, Republican leadership needs to. They have a mandate. They won a gigantic election, and they didn't win because they're Republicans. They won because the Tea Party movement and people who supported the Tea Party movement didn't like the alternative.
Okay.
And they've failed.
Then Ryan, you have to accept the fact then that Barack Obama had a giant mandate, and the Republican Party certainly didn't accept that. They did everything they possibly could during his first 2 years to block him time after time after time. He won, 53, how many states did he win?
35.
35. I mean, he won 53% of the vote. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was a giant win. And so, of course, you could say, well, that's a mandate. Y'all didn't accept that, so why should the Democratic Party accept a mandate when it really wasn't a mandate? Instead, it was a pushback against the Democratic Party.
Obama's election was based on a vague notion of hope and change.
Oh,
and when people finally realized what it represented,
so he had a mandate for change, and boy, did he bring it.
He promised government transparency. People voted for Barack Obama because they saw corruption in the Republican Party, and they wanted change towards an open, a more transparent government.
They were dumb in 2008, but they figured it out in 2000.
It's over policy.
Thanks for being here, guys.
It's policy, not personality.
We'll do this again, I hope. And we invite you to visit our home online at HoustonPBS.org. Click on the local program bar at Red, White, and Blue. Read about the guests, watch the shows, follow up discussion. And until next time, get informed and get active.